thanks for coming and attending and listening to all these incredibly fascinating people. We have a lot to get through. I think the format we're going to do is I'm going to ask just one question to each of our panelists to kind of get things going. They'll have a response, and then I think we're going to open it up to you guys for questions after that, and I'm sure you'll come up with far more interesting questions than I'm able to come up with. But just for the sake of kind of getting these discussions going, I think I'll just go along the line and bring up something that potentially occurred to me as each of our speakers were giving their presentation, and just kind of see what their response would be. It can be as short or as long as you guys want, because I think probably the more important thing is to have all of you guys ask your questions, because I'm sure there are a lot of really, really great ones. So I'm gonna start with Mara here to my left, and so what I found interesting about your work, one of the many things that I found interesting about your work was the idea of the representation, especially from a female perspective, of what so much of this, the AI technology that is being utilized with the face filters and everything else. And forgive me if this is a sort of pretty obvious question for you, but I do wonder, as the commoditization of female form and female appearance and all this kind of stuff, continues to develop. Where do you find that? Do you just respond to it in your work, or is there a way? Is there a sort of influence in your work that you hope will change the development of it?
So a bit of a dense question. Just speaking totally personally, I'm informed by feminism, but I think for me, when art starts to take on a type of dogma or an agenda, it often falls flat. So for me, I'm engaged in my thoughts and problematizing some of these softwares and apps. In my own work, I think what I want is for people to experience a bit more ambiguity. I think it's important, these questions, insofar as a lot of the apps and software designers, there's a real homogeny in terms of who's designing them. Do I need to say it? Like white men who are in their 30s. It's not like 20s, yeah, 20s, yeah, that's right. It's more like 20s. And I think that it's important that there's more, there's more diversity in terms of, in general, who's deciding. When we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about really big concepts. What is intelligence? What is the self? These questions are huge, and who's deciding what is the self and what is intelligence? There's a lot of history for us to learn from, and I think that with these technologies, which are extremely powerful, a lot of my work is actually the technologies developed by the military, right? Facial recognition and computer vision is like extremely militarized. So I think that there is a lot of violence sort of embedded in many levels happening with these technologies I'm working with. And so I think mainly the most important thing is that a lot of future violence can be avoided if there was more diversity in terms of color, gender, in some of these places. And I don't have the answer for that. It's just, I think that these major questions, we want to have a diversity of minds deciding what is intelligence, how are these technologies going to be used, the future of all of these big questions. So.
Fantastic, thank you. And David, when you were talking specifically about your work with your autistic subjects, something struck me that was kind of interesting in the sense that you were talking about how there's a view about autism sometimes that almost veers towards the mechanical, in the sense that the way they respond to things, there's a repetition, and in the same way you were talking about the response of AI, it almost seemed to me like there was a strange kind of link between the way that people viewed the role autistic people could potentially play in the workplace, and then also the role that we hear about when you think about the jobs that AI would sort of come in and replace.
What's really interesting is that just in the years that I've been pursuing this research, a lot of the jobs that were targeted by the various autism entrepreneurs that I investigated have been automated. So for instance, I talked with all of you now about software testing, or QA. There's fewer and fewer roles for QA as such. There's now QA engineers who are automating scripts to do this kind of work. And the same is true, I'm sure, of car washes, although I don't understand that space as well. The basic point is that a lot of the work that I was talking about with you is being automated. And I think it's not a coincidence that folks are conceiving of autistic adults and machines as capable of doing the same thing, or that the potentially autistic adults are almost as if they were kind of already automated beings. And I think that gets to a broader problem in our public culture, which is that autism often becomes the sort of space, metaphoric space, for navigating the sort of ambivalences and ambiguities around changes in technology. So if you see characters in movies or in television shows, they're almost always kind of like cyborgs. And a lot of my autistic friends will say, do you notice that whenever there's a cyborg on TV, they're actually autistic? And vice versa, that a lot of the representations of autism aren't really about autism as such, because autism is such a variable and diverse condition. They're actually the sort of metaphor for what would it mean for a human to be more machine-like or a machine to be more human-like, this sort of intermediary zone between our current concept of what it means to be a human versus what a machine does, and what we perceive or imagine the future might hold for, as I'm sure Tobias will soon talk about, transformations of the human. So just the last point there is that such representations can be damaging because, you know, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Mark, my question for you is that as we sort of, you know, touched upon, I think, in some of the other talks, is that there's certain human problems have been solved over time in history through animal systems, or, you know, non-human systems, and your expertise as, you know, the I think self-professed leech guy makes me want to ask about whether has there been an example? Is there an example of a problem that has been solved by the leech ecosystem?
I mean, I want to apologize. I thought this was going to be an evening about vomiting and diarrhea, and then you guys are talking about AI, and I feel like the odd guy. In fact, yeah, so there's this weird thing that, yeah, so first of all, you're absolutely correct. Biology, zoology, botany, whatever, so the natural world has solved lots and lots of problems that we want to solve, whether it's in automation or in mechanics or engineering, whatever. And there's a whole field of bioengineering that's out there. Even something as simple, I did talk about toxins at the beginning with all of you several times tonight. And one of the first big blockbuster anti-cancer drug was Taxol. And it was used for breast cancer, and it worked actually very, very well, but you had to get it from the yew tree. Because to do the organic chemistry to make Taxol, you would need like the pressure of the center of the earth and the temperature of the sun in a bottle. But it turns out the trees figured this out already, and we can use that. We use precursors now. So that's just an example, not from my own work. Leeches, I can tie leeches to anything, trust me. The leeches, your sixth sense, we have an exhibition on senses right now. You do have a sixth sense. It's your sense of gravity. Your sense of balance is a sixth sense. You have a seventh, eighth, and ninth as well. But you have that because you have bones inside your ear that if you tip that way or you tip that way, they start responding differently with your nerves. Leeches don't have that. How do you take something that doesn't have stapes in an eardrum or whatever and figure out what is from up and down? Well, leeches, it turns out, the medicinal leeches swim in a perfect sine wave. I mean, an absolutely perfect sine wave. And they're doing that, yes, to get from point A to point B, but what they are is parts of their body are constantly falling through the water. And it's how they're sensing that falling and then correcting for it that gives them a sense of up from down when they don't have otherwise a sense of balance or a sense of gravity like we do. So there's different ways that the natural world has solved various problems that I think people are trying to solve in developing smart technology that can be leveraged, and is being leveraged as well. The helicopter blades, actually, Sikorsky looked at the way dragonfly wings work in order to figure that one out. Am I answering your question?
Absolutely.
I could keep going.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And Jessica, I actually, there's a little bit of a overlap with the question to Mark there, just because, well, kind of, not in a very, very broad sense, but just because I thought one of the most interesting things about what we were talking about is the idea of outsourcing things to non-human systems. I think it's, you know, it's hilarious in some ways, but also kind of brilliant. And obviously termites was the example that you gave in your work. But I'm just, you know, as something like that had never ever occurred to me in my life before. I mean, are there other things that you investigated or researched into or played with that sort of would be something similar in a system like that was a non-human system?
You know, I mean, the whole idea of outsourcing to artworks to multiplicity of agents came from the fact that you know, I came to a realization that collective intelligence is already like recognized as, or we can think about it as a general intellect, some kind of multiplicity of authors or agents that are responsible for human knowledge, for how societies develop. But when it comes to art and culture, it's still this kind of archetype of a singular individual, very often male author. And we can, for example, already see that like platforms like Wikipedia are already like developing, you know, multiple authors contributing to knowledge, even though there is hierarchy. But there are already, for example, scientists that are co-opting slime molds for computation and resolving some problems. Like there's a Center for Unconventional Computing in England when they are conducting, like, for example, resolving like the traveling salesman problem to the body of the slime mold. I don't know if you're familiar with the slime mold. It's an organism, it's a single-celled organism that in the situations when it's in danger or there's like lack of nutrients or water, it's aggregating and moving as a superorganism, and it can actually solve a maze. So it was like one of the like most direct inspirations for my work. So I started thinking about how we could co-opt a multiplicity of agents, both non-human and human, to create this kind of collective intelligence, collectively authored artworks. And I started first with termites, but I'm also working with slime molds and bacteria. And more recently, as I was talking about it tonight, also platforms of human agents. But the difference is that using platforms such as Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is this piecemeal work outsourcing platform, allowed me to also create a system of profit sharing, to think about how we can think more profoundly about the ways of redistributing capital through platforms like this, to kind of, again, like sort of ironically subvert the system where the art market that created this like huge surplus value machine can actually be used to some degree cynically to pay these workers around the world. So we're using it's a form of, you know, like subverting the systems into something opposite what they could be, and thinking about this emergent property that exists in nature, but how we can also think about it in culture, and how a platform that was created for purposes of exploitation can actually be used in an opposite way.
Tobias, you also brought up the idea of animal intelligence, I believe. And I'd be interested, because actually in the little part that I was in, you didn't talk about that. And I would be quite interested in seeing how the idea of animal intelligence intersects with the idea of human intelligence that you've also talked about, artificial intelligence. Where does the animal intelligence part lie in that?
Sure. So, as you all know, traditionally, intelligence is exclusively linked to humans. So in a traditional philosophical discourse, humans are intelligent and the world is intelligible. And so when we now have when you take that just for one moment, you have the human on one side, and you have the rest of the world on the other side. You can repeat this in multiple ways. Humans are thinking things in a world of mere things. Humans are subjects in a world composed of objects, i.e. they're completely exhausted by the natural processes, for example, or chemical processes that happen in them. So the classical concept of a leech as a machine, for example. So if I now decouple the concept of intelligence from the exclusive link to the human and extend it to leeches, to machines, to microbes, or to birds, then I do at the very least two things. One thing is I change this juxtaposition of the human here and the rest of the world there, and I make the human intelligent, but it's a form of intelligence that is one entry into a series of intelligences. And I do something to animals, leeches or microbes, and also actually to machines if they're intelligent, and I lift them into a different space from where they were before. So uncoupling intelligence from the exclusive link to the human almost inevitably means that I repose the question, what is a human? What is the role or place of the human in the world? What is the status of non-human intelligences in the world? I actually can sort of expand this for one moment to leeches, for example, or to bacteria. So when you all have heard about CRISPR the last few months, or actually the last few weeks. CRISPR was not invented by humans. CRISPR was invented almost 3.5 billion years ago by bacteria. It's actually part of a bacterial immune system to fight off viruses, right? So in a certain way, humans have merely repurposed CRISPR, but it remains a living natural technology. So if you just soak that in for a moment, you have a concept of technology or of a tool that is no longer juxtaposed to nature as we usually do it. So there are natural things and there are human-made things. And then you could say, my God, the concept of technology or machines that we have inherited from the Industrial Revolution that is sort of saying, here are tools and machines, and here is nature, is actually unfortunate. It's a misunderstanding of how we have to build tools or techniques. They have to be aligned with natural processes or work alongside them. And then you enter also philosophical terrain, because the ways in which we have defined ourselves as being the inventors of tools that do not come from nature, you don't find there, and therefore we're outside of nature, fails. So I'm very interested in these little, seemingly everyday, but simultaneously very strongly philosophical questions.
Thank you. And Brian, I'm going to ask you something very specific in response to something you said, which I found really interesting. Being slightly unhealthily obsessed with plane crashes, you had said something about your feeling about when a plane is being landed through automation, through artificial intelligence, and the safety and security you felt with that. Sort of extrapolating that from not just planes, but to cars and everything else we were talking about. I'm interested in a little bit about sort of like where human error and the sort of limitations of human ability can run up against the automation aspect. And I think in planes you've seen that a couple of times where, especially Airbuses that are heavily automated, then there have been a couple of times where the human error part of it has actually caused a situation to go in a really bad place. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but at least from my limited understanding, that's what it was. But anyway, it just struck me as being something interesting to ask you about.
Well, yeah, the Airbus thing is complicated because basically it was a struggle of will between the plane and the pilots, and I am not sure we want to say that the plane was right and the pilots were wrong. I mean, you could consider it the plane's fault. It's just that we don't assign fault.
Or I guess the system,
but that doesn't matter so much. I think the point is this, that the systems we have that, ooh, sorry, I should not cough with the microphone on. The systems we have that work well, I think, have a pretty stable fixed world model. And they work pretty well with respect to it. And with flying planes, we have constructed the world in such a way that it fits the capabilities of the plane. And so therefore their world model is pretty accurate. And actually computers do a pretty good job of dealing with fixed, stable, ontological realms. I fundamentally don't think the world is in fact a stable ontological realm. And I think that if we unleash intelligences that deal with the world as if it was a stable ontological realm, it's going to be a disaster. We make mistakes, but we make mistakes with respect to our ontological parsing of things. But what we do that is stunningly impressive is we figure out what the conception of the world is that's appropriate in any given situation. We're very light on our feet. We change it radically and stuff. I mean, think about this, what categories are appropriate? What categories do you think are appropriate in terms of which to assess a potential lover and mate? It's like any of you who have a list of categories, I think, are in trouble because people aren't subject to that kind of categorization. And I think our skills are much more in this kind of fluid, flexible adaptability of our conception of the world than they are in being relentlessly, rigidly attuned to one. So we make some mistakes there. But some of the mistakes we make there are because, in fact, we are actually don't think that conceptual scheme is actually particularly useful. Because conceptual schemes don't work very well. I mean, if I'm near you and you're near someone else, I'm probably sort of near that person, but you're near someone, and then the computer says, okay, well, somebody's 77,000 people away, you're near them, because, and it's like, no, near doesn't work like that. It's like, forget it, relax, just. And I think the idea that we make mistakes, I mean, surely we mess up. I absolutely mess up. I mean, I think humility, if AI has taught me anything, and I think has taught people anything, it's humility. I mean, it's just humility in the face of the inadequacy of every idea we've ever had as to what constitutes intelligence. I think we should be humble about our errors, but also impressed by the fact that we can make errors because we take on this task that the machines aren't yet able to do, of figuring out what sense of intelligibility is the world intelligible under.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up. Hopefully we have time. Yep, go ahead.
So question one. How many of you have had acupuncture and liked it? Yeah, acupuncture. And liked it. Awesome. So I'm wondering, how often in history do you think leeches were actually placed on acupuncture points and it felt super good and people were like, wow, it's healed me?
I'm sorry, the question again was, how many times have people said, oh wow, the leeches have healed me?
No, I mean, how many times in history do you think leeches were placed on the right spots, like acupuncture points, and it just felt really good, and people were like, wow, this has healed me?
Well, so there's an interesting, it's a good question in a sense, because if you think about what the traditional role of a physician was, this is before we had actuarials and people counting percentages and things like that. Turns out the origin of clinical medicine is with leeches too. I could wax on and on. But basically what would happen, right? You're sick, you go to the doctor does something, you get better, the doctor says, I made you better. Or you're sick, you go to the doctor, and you don't get better and you die, and the doctor says, there's nothing I can do. And that was sort of the two possible outcomes. And so are there cases in which, I'm sure there are cases in which people have felt bad about X, some upset or whatever, and I don't know, stuck their finger in a light socket. And then a day later, they're better. Not because they stuck their finger in a light socket, but because their body allowed them to get better for whatever reason. They just happened to stick their finger in a light socket the day before. As humans, we really like to draw connections between things. When they occur in orders, we like to assign cause and effect to things because of sequencing when it really isn't there. So how many times I can't give you an answer. Would it surprise me? Not at all. But yeah, so the way that we do this now is we take a group of people the size of this room, and half of you we give a treatment to, the other half we don't give the treatment to, and then we look down the road to see if there's anything different. In fact, we can even do it as a crossover where half of you we give the treatment to, half of you we don't. We look to see whether or not there's an effect, and then the group that got the treatment don't get the treatment, the group that don't do, or unless I just screwed that up. And better than that, none of us know who's got what treatment, and then only at the end you look at the data and say, is there any there? And that's a double-blind crossover experiment. That's been done recently with leeches for arthritis. Can we cure arthritis with leeches? Here's the problem. It's impossible to have a blind study putting leeches or not putting leeches on a knee. You know who's got the leeches, and they know whether they've got it. So there are limitations to that kind of study. And I'm going to shut up now because I'll just, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you. It's on? Cool. Hi guys, thank you. Just being conscientious of like the overlapping themes of the exchange and the Institute and Nissar's background, I'm curious from all of you if you've seen any film or television or art lately that you think depicts these kinds of scientific concepts you're grappling with that you would recommend to all of us.
Is that for everyone?
Yeah. Yeah, go for it, guys.
Ex Machina was pretty good. I don't know how people in the field felt about it.
Brian doesn't agree.
I like the ending.
It's good in the following way. It's good to have an undergraduate class and show it, and then have a discussion with the class as to what they think was good and not good about it. I mean, there are some things that are, I don't know. I don't see movies. I'm just hopeless media person. It struck me as so slick that it was hard to actually get a hold of.
What about Her?
Anything. I haven't seen it.
Oh.
But also, look, even Ex Machina. You have a beautiful, objectified female as an individual. I mean, why is an AI going to be an individual in that sense as opposed to a cloud kind of thing? And why is it going to have, unless I suppose capitalism will actually construct AIs that look like that, but that's a fact about capitalism and about people. It's not a fact about AI and so on. It's an excrescence of human imagination. It's not actually insight into what's happening, I think.
Is there anything?
And these, sorry, not that I have any feelings about this, but a lot of these things are distracting. Excuse me. Because they construct in media fantasies that people have about the technology in such a way that the public is distracted into thinking that that's actually what's about to happen, when I think what's actually going to happen probably has nothing to do with that.
Has it ever been handled well in your?
Sorry?
Has it ever been handled well, like in your opinion, in anything you've seen, just out of interest?
I don't know. All this Huxley.
I think there's maybe one film that it doesn't talk about AI, but it kind of it's a documentary. I think it's called Into Eternity. It's a film about documentary which was made maybe like 3 years ago about the future of nuclear waste, but actually it was from the anthropological point of view. So it's following a group of anthropologists who were hired by Onkalo, which is a place in Finland, which is like a biggest repository of nuclear waste, where they started, they opened it and they are collecting this nuclear waste there, and when it's filled in, it's going to be sealed. And the main problem became not its radioactivity, not that it may leak, none of this. This already they dealt with. The biggest problem was when it's going to be sealed, how do you label it for future humans, like humans in 300 years or maybe a couple thousand years, not to touch it, not to open it because it's highly radioactive? And it turned out that it's absolutely impossible for this group of anthropologists that were involved to come up with a way of labeling it, because these humans may be speaking another language, they may not even use visual language or alphabet. There's possibility that like the evolution will go into such a direction. So this turned into a debate, and they came to a conclusion that the best way is not to market at all, because in fact anything could cause like curiosity. If it's going to even be like a pictorial sign, so they decided to just leave it completely unmarked. But there is a very interesting debate that is actually about what is humanity. It turns into this total abstraction. I find this like a interesting point.
One thing.
Into Eternity, I think it's called. Yeah, it's a documentary.
One thing that I find interesting, is this on? Not on. I think, oh, it is on. Okay. So I literally never watch movies, and that's partly because I'm such an anxious character, and I spend my whole day thinking about how things are or could be. Then once it's evening, and I'm just home, and I have to enter the brain space of someone else, doesn't work quite well. I'm too nervous. However, I give a lot of talk, largely because I enjoy giving talks and having the interaction with the audience. And for now, basically a year, after every single talk I gave, someone approaches me and says, you regularly watch Black Mirror, right? And I say, no, what's Black Mirror? And everyone's then disappointed, so I take it that Black Mirror is actually a series that discusses many of the questions that you have heard about tonight, but I have yet to see one episode.
I'll throw a sort of curveball answer to this. It was called You Were Never Really Here. It's a recent Joaquin Phoenix movie. Thematically, generically, it's just a sort of thriller, crime drama. It doesn't, the story and the themes that it addresses aren't particularly innovative or don't really comment in a particularly compelling fashion on our times. But what's interesting about it is the way it's shot and what the camera looks at and the way it lingers on space and lingers on devices. And it sort of resists the anthropocentric form of film. And so I think experiments less about, I would guess that a movie like Ex Machina, you can trace its generic antecedents all the way back to, it's even if the context is new, the story is not. I think films like that are really exploring a non-anthropocentric viewpoint in the way it's shot, or art that does something similar. I think that to me is potentially more exciting than the movies that are actually about AI or explicitly trying to make a claim about the future or transformations of our collective existence.
Can we get David a job greenlighting movies at a studio? Because I think that would be,
certainly get
be great
paid
to
more.
hear. Yeah.
Just kidding.
One thing about, I don't have a television. I never lived with a television in my life. But the little sense I have about them is I find them stunningly conservative with respect to what they imagine. And I actually think the gravity of what's happening is sufficiently high that we just don't know what to imagine. It's not that I think, people aren't very smart. We should get some people with good imaginations to go into making movies or something. That's not the problem. I imagine all kinds of things, but I can't imagine anything that I can take seriously as actually being accurate about where we're headed. And that, I think, is the really profound point, which is that I don't think the machines are going to take over. I don't think, whatever, those doomsday scenarios, I think, are unrealistic. But the change in the human condition, I think, is kind of epical, and I draw a blank. And as far as I can tell, everyone I can talk to draws a blank, too. Maybe they just draw a blank when they talk to me. But I don't think we know how to imagine the future.
Well, somebody should, right?
Well, yeah, but look, I'm a philosopher. Should is easy.
I think one
People
issue
try.
is that there's and David mentioned this, there's a narrative arc. We have forms for storytelling, and this is a conduit for these imaginings of the future.
Right.
And there are tried and true sort of narrative arcs. And unfortunately, I think that, like you're saying, a lot of AI is exceeding this sort of container of these types of narrative arcs that we have, which make a good story, which make a good film, which holds people's attention. And we had the wonderful opportunity to meet with the guy involved with producing Black Mirror, which is really, at first I was like, why are we doing this? This is so weird. But anyways, I really enjoy that series. But at the same time, I often feel sort of disappointed by this utopic, dystopic polarity. And I think that I didn't feel very optimistic, actually, after his talk, because so much of what drives Hollywood is not finding narratives which are going to dovetail with these new visions of the future, but that Hollywood is, and cinema is so driven by capitalist profit that it's like you just need the same story over and over again. And, you know, like, I was like, but don't we, you know, if we see film as being not just reflections of reality, but also involved in producing reality, like, what is the responsibility of cinema to be giving us other forms of entertainment, which are not just these storylines which repeat over and over again, but which are embedded in storytelling, which is ancient. So I think that it's like a question, I think there's a real issue with the container as limiting imaginations because of, you know, and I love literature, but maybe we need like a more, I don't know, off the top of my head, like Thomas Bernhardt's like my favorite author. And maybe it's like we need authors like that to be writing these other alternative types of narratives, which are not just always about selling, you know, but yeah.
I'm actually curious about this. You know, for the longest times in which humans have lived, there was a perceived continuity between past and present, and actually future. Your grandfather, going to be speaking about men for a second, was a carpenter. Your dad's a carpenter. You're likely to be a carpenter. Your kids are likely to be a carpenter. It's a continuity. And when you sort of investigate the historical record, i.e. books that have been written, then you find that around 1800 there is a big rupture between past and present. People are really concerned that how things were is no longer how things are. And that, you know, that is often then described as the emergence of modernity and things like this. People invented new categories. And there is one great book by a sociologist called Niklas Luhmann. The book is called Observations on Modernity, where he makes a very clever point, and he says, in the 1970s, context of environmentalism and fears about nuclear war, it's for the first time in human history that there is a perceived rupture between present and future. And the openness of the future that is irreducible, that you can never contain, is experienced in the present. What do we do with the nuclear waste? It will have future consequences. And there is no answer to it, and no one knows what to do with it. But it's actually interesting to think about, what does future mean here? Does it simply mean that we have no answers? Well, that cannot possibly be defining the future. Does it mean that our narratives fail us in the face of what's possible with machines, for example? That's not really about the future. It's not a temporal question. So it's actually kind of curious to wonder about these things. What we definitely can say today is that there seem to be many events that fail the answers that we have. We cannot tame the machines and the possibilities we have with the answers that we have. And that brings me back to philosophical questions. And unless we sort of value philosophy, and that actually here is philosophy in the broadest sense of the term, I don't mean a philosophy department at the university. I mean people who enjoy instances in which events occur that we cannot answer with our old questions without losing what's going on. We like to inhabit such open moments. This can be artists, this can be engineers, this can be traditional or professional philosophers. So unless we make such philosophical reflections and artistic explorations of such openness a part of business, a part of research, we're going to invent more and more tools that exceeds with Mara the narratives that we have and that leave us in a feeling of helplessness. It's unfortunate and really unnecessary.
Two things. I mean, I completely agree with Tobias. Just one, note this moment. Fred Jameson, a famous literary theorist at Duke, said once, I don't know if he said this in print, I've just heard him say it, that his students have a much easier time imagining the end of the world than they do imagining the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
Which is,
wow.
which is haunting, I think, in a good way. And the other thing I was going to say is, so undergraduates I teach have said, well, look, what's a good example of something I can't imagine? And, you know, it's sort of wonder, well, actually, how can I give a really compelling example of something you can't imagine? And here's what I've come up with as my best shot so far. We live in a world that is 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal. We'll all learn that in high school or whatever. How about a world which had 2 spatial dimensions and 2 temporal dimensions? Now, I blow a fuse, I have no idea what that means. I mean, I just have no idea at all. And I think maybe somebody can. I can write the Lorentz equations for it. I mean, it's not that we can't construct the physics of it, it's that I can't imagine it. And I think that I mean, we have to imagine, as you said, and I actually would put my bet on art. I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm thrilled that there are artists as part of this working group, because I actually think art, more than, not movies, but, I mean, not that they couldn't be movies, but you know what I mean. Because I think art historically has been at the forefront of just blowing up, or blowing up what it is that we can't imagine in a certain sense. But I think the discontinuity is going to be that profound, and we have to take that seriously, or we're going to delude ourselves.
I think we have time for one last question. Go ahead.
Basically, I just have a question for everybody about value. And it's interesting to kind of touch on it in a lot of different places. Times when humans...
Doesn't sound like
Oh, how about now? Okay, cool. So there's just been a really fascinating point to kind of all these places where, like, for example, humans at a time when they weren't considered human if they labored in the field. Only people at a certain intelligence level or knowledge level were human. Or places where, in animal intelligence, for example, we've kind of set ourselves aside from that. Or places where there's programs for people on the autism spectrum, but only a specific kind of person on the autism spectrum. So just to kind of summarize my question, I'm guessing everybody here has at least some impression or opinion on universal basic income or something to that effect. Like the idea of artificial intelligence replacing jobs across the world. People not being able to provide for themselves because they've been actually fundamentally replaced by something that can do everything that they're capable of, everything they've been trained for. So I'm really hoping that maybe some of you guys can touch on that. Thanks. And also, deeply rewarding experience. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
When we were called to order tonight, after we sat in these chairs, we were talking about the relative merits of UBI versus guarantee of jobs as a human right, and employment, and you were referring to, I read with labor and
Work and action.
And action. So yes, that's my reaction to your question. I think very serious, very serious.
Well, my job's not really a job. I mean, I feel like I'm on permanent vacation. But it actually raises a point, and that is that if we're going to be underemployed or unemployed or whatever in terms of the classic sense of the word working for income, I'm all in favor of a universal, basic income. We're kind of doing it anyway. The Farm Bill got passed, right? Or is going to get passed? Got passed. And there's the giving people enough money to buy groceries is sort of already going in that direction anyway. I mean, there are different ways of doing it. We still have, as humans, we still have to occupy our time doing stuff, whether it's climbing mountains or collecting leeches in a forest. I really actually enjoy it. Or painting or doing something. We have to be doing things. And so we need to not just, it's like the end of capitalism. If you really do imagine the end of capitalism, then what will people be doing? Because we need to be doing something, or we end up doing we end up doing bad things to other people. So that's not really an answer, but yes, I have thought of it.
So one of the arguments that is often raised, we were just discussing this, is that what is going to happen to education if UBI is introduced? Because although, for example, like there are examples of kind of proto-UBI, such as Bolsa da Familia in Brazil, which was actually probably one of very few places where kind of proto-UBI worked, and people were being paid sort of basic income for sending their kids to school, and actually resolved a problem of illiteracy in Brazil to a very high degree. It's like, I think 30% less than 25 years ago. But at the same time, like a lot of people are talking about the fact that UBI may have this side effect that people who are, that many people are driven to education because of jobs, because of promise of a potential job. Not everybody is studying, but because just they are looking for occupation or are interested or curious. And it's a kind of a question mark. Very difficult to say what's going to happen, whether it's going to cause people to be less interested in studying or not. And I just wanted to kind of like make a more general comment that for me and personally in my work, what is most interesting, I mean, both terrifying and interesting, is that all these errors, these unexpected, extremely rare events or accidents of all these like systems of our societies, of these new technologies, none of the, I mean, to answer some of the questions that you asked about, like whether there are any cultural like films or any books that answer certain or imagine these scenarios. I mean, there are a lot of amazing science fiction books written about AI. You know, like I'm Polish, Stanislaw Lem has foreseen AI, you know, in the 1950s and has been writing about it for many years. But actually, it's never, the things that he described, he also kind of anticipated the internet. It never emerges the same way that is imagined through science fiction literature. Actually, and what is most important is that the problems and the errors and the obstacles are always very different from what was imagined. And it's very both good and bad. The good thing is that we're living in times, although like algorithms are applied to everything, but there are still certain uncomputable things in our societies. Of course, it can lead to the fact that we are not robust to all these dangers. But what would be if anything could be computed, including, you know, like how we're going to react, how we're going to evolve, what we're going to love and think, and so on. And so maybe there is actually, you know, kind of a consolation in this, that we can't really foresee this.
I have sort of two different views on UBI, or basic income grant, big. There are a couple of countries where it has been systematically given out for many years now, and where it has been carefully studied. Probably the most famous ones are South Africa and Alaska. And one thing that's very interesting, that's a very straightforward, almost economic answer to the success of basic income grant, is that in these countries, the basic income grant is not enough for survival. It is actually an economic incentive to certain things, like in Brazil, sending kids to school, or taking your HIV medicine on a regular basis, etc. And in these countries, it has worked fully. So there are no experiments where you have so much money that literally you wouldn't have to do anything but just receive the money, which is interesting to think about. Another thing that is really sort of interesting to reflect on is the logic that informs the basic income grant originally. It's basically, it's not social welfare, right? Which is a very different kind of principle. And so the idea of the basic income grant in South Africa, for example, has been that this will liberate you to some degree so that you can have entrepreneurial impulses. And the idea is that not everyone will have this, but some people will have it. And they will build a business, and they will build up capital or income, and it will distribute, and it will be good for the whole community in which they are. So it's almost a neoliberal incentive tool to some degree. And when you compare this, and that's sort of the philosophical question that I find very interesting, to the social welfare. Social welfare in its modern version was not invented by Bismarck in Germany, as people always say. It was really invented by the Beveridge Report in the 1940s, and it had a completely racial background. They recognized, they call it a dysgenic function. Rich English people do not reproduce enough, i.e. the British race will decline. The very poor people reproduce too much. That's also bad because they don't have, so to speak, enough reason, and the British race will decline too. But in the middle, and that's sort of historically the birth of the middle class, there's a group of people that's perfectly intelligent if they only would have public schools, public health insurance, and reasonable food. Now, as we all know, the British failed on the food, but the other two things are pretty well. But the reason why they did this, literally, is to maintain the British race. So today, basic income doesn't work like this. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. More than 40% of the people who live in the Bay Area are not citizens. I'm sure in LA is no different. They have H-1Bs, they have J visa, they're undocumented immigrants. Are they excluded from the universal basic income grant? What's the reason to give that to them? Is it the economic incentive? Well, then the social incentive seems to be not working anymore, or is defined through the economic. So there are many questions that actually need to be asked in terms of political communities that are related to the basic income that no one asks, right?
There's also, if I can follow up on Anicka, the thing about education. So I'm ancient, and things were sort of different back then. But one thing that was different was schooling and education were not the same thing in the 60s when I grew up. You went to school for 12 years, and then you went to university, and you went for an education. It was not schooling. And then, if you wanted to be an intellectual or something, you would stay in an educational institution and get maybe an MA or PhD or something. But if you didn't like education, that wasn't intellectual inquiry, was not your, you went back to school, like law school or medical school and so on and so on. And if you don't know the difference between education and school, think about sex. There is sex education, and it's not sex schooling. There really was a difference. I worry about many things. I will not keep you here while I expound on all the things I worry about. One thing I worry about is the future of higher education at the moment, because the university I teach in, which is a public university, all universities in Canada, so I live in Canada, all universities in Canada are public universities. There are no private universities there. I worry that it's turning into schooling. And the thing you say haunts me, because I think that is why a lot of students are at the university, is for schooling. They want to be trained.
Yes, of course.
And I think that's kind of tragic. But the optimistic note is, tonight is not schooling, this is education. So, thank you.
Thanks, guys. I think that's a great place to wrap up. I think there's some pizza left in the back if anybody wants to take it home. I think we have a few minutes of chat before we're going to get thrown out, but I think actually that's only about 5 minutes now. But I wanted to thank everybody for coming, and please give them a big round of applause for Brian, for Tobias, for Agnieszka, who also, Agnieszka made a very difficult last-minute schedule to be here with us tonight, so we're very thankful for that. For Mark, for David, and for Mara, thank you for everybody for coming and staying and everything else.